Sorry about that, boys and girls. We had a little technical difficulty. We're back at it. We're going to finish the chapter Prairie Fire, chapter 22. Great flames came roaring, flaring and twisting high. Twists of flame broke loose and came down on the wind to blaze up in the grasses. Far ahead of the roaring wall of fire, a red light came from the rolling black clouds of smoke overhead. Mary and Laura stood against the house and held hands and trembled. Baby Carrie was in the house. Laura wanted to do something, but inside her head was a roaring and whirling like the fire. Her middle shook, and tears poured out of her stinging eyes. Her eyes and her nose and her throat stung with smoke. Jack howled. Bunny and Pet and Patty were jerking at the ropes and squealing horribly. The orange-yellow, terrible flames were coming faster than horses can run, and their quivering light danced over everything. Pa's little fire had made a burned black strip. The little fire went backing slowly away against the wind. It went slowly crawling to meet the racing, furious big fire. And suddenly the big fire swallowed the little one. The wind rose to a high, crackling, rushing shriek. Flames climbed into the crackling air. Fire was all around the house. Then it was over. The fire went roaring past and away. Pa and Ma were beating out little fires here and there in the yard. When they were all out, Ma came to the house to wash her hands and face. She was all streaked with smoke and sweat, and she was trembling. She said there was nothing to worry about. The backfire saved us, she said, and all's well that ends well. The air smelled scorched, and to the very edge of the sky the prairie was burned naked and black. Threads of smoke rose from it. Ashes blew on the wind. Everything felt different and miserable. But Pa and Ma were cheerful because the fire was gone, and it had not done any harm. Pa said that the fire had not missed them far, but a miss is as good as a mile. He asked Ma, "If it had come while I was in Independence, what would you have done?" "We would have gone to the creek with the birds and the rabbits, of course," Ma said. All the wild things in the prairie had known what to do. They ran and flew and hopped and crawled as fast as they could go to the water that would keep them safe from the fire. Only the little soft striped gophers had gone down deep into their holes, and they were the first to come up and look around at the bare smoking prairie. Then out of the creek bottom the birds came flying over it, and a rabbit cautiously hopped and looked. It was a long, long time before the snakes crawled out of the bottoms and the prairie hens came walking. The fire had gone out among the bluffs. It had never reached the creek bottoms or the Indian camps. That night, Mr. Edwards and Mr. Scott came to see Pa. They were worried because they thought that perhaps the Indians had started that fire on purpose to burn out the white settlers. Pa didn't believe it. He said that the Indians had always burned the prairie to make green grass grow more quickly and traveling easier. Their ponies couldn't gallop through the thick, tall, dead grass. Now the ground was clear, and he was glad of it because plowing would be easier. While they were talking, they could hear drums beating in the Indian camps and shouts. Laura sat still as a mouse on the doorstep and listened to the talk and to the Indians. The stars hung low and large and quivering over the burned prairie, and the wind blew gently in Laura's hair. Mr. Edwards said there were too many Indians in those camps. He didn't like it. Mr. Scott said he didn't know why so many of those savages were coming together if they didn't mean devilment. Uh-oh, this is not a good thing, boys and girls, what I'm going to say. But this is what Mr. Scott said. "The only good Indian is a dead Indian," Mr. Scott said. Pa said he didn't know about that. He figured that Indians would be as peaceable as anybody else if they were let alone. On the other hand, they had been moved west so many times that naturally they hated white folks. But an Indian ought to have sense enough to know when he was licked. With soldiers at Fort Gibson and Fort Dodge, Pa didn't believe these Indians would make any trouble. As to why they were congregating in these camps, Scott, I can tell you that, he said. They're getting ready for their big spring buffalo hunt. He said there were half a dozen tribes down in those camps. Usually the tribes were fighting each other, but every spring they made peace and all came together for the big hunt. They're sworn to peace among themselves, he said, and they're thinking about hunting the buffalo, so it's not likely they'll start on the warpath against us. They'll have their talks and their feasts, and then one day they'll all hit the trail after the buffalo herds. The buffalo will be working their way north pretty soon, following the green grass. By George, I'd like to go on a hunt like that myself. It must be a sight to see. Well, maybe you're right about it, Ingalls, Mr. Scott said slowly. Anyway, I'll be glad to tell Mrs. Scott what you say. She can't get the Minnesota massacres out of her head. And then the next chapter, chapter 23, is called Indian War Cry. So what Mr. Ingalls was saying here, he was saying that Native Americans or Indians keep getting pushed west by the government, and they keep getting pushed off their land. So he can understand why the Indians would be mad at the white people. And Mr. Scott and Mr. Edwards and Mrs. Scott and Mrs. Ingalls, they all do not like the Indians. They call them savages, and savages are creatures or people that don't live the way that we think they should live. Like Indians lived at this time very, very different than we did. They lived in teepees and they hunted all their food. And well, Mr. Ingalls hunted all his food, but they didn't have homes to live in. They picked up and moved a lot. So they called them savages because they thought they lived like animals. So there was a lot of anger between the Indians and the settlers at this time. Tomorrow we'll keep going with Indian War Cry, or on Monday. Have a good weekend, everybody.